I wanted to talk a little bit about feudalism and scholastic economic thought, something we might consider the economic thought of the medieval period. Medieval society really reaches its apex in Europe between the 12th and 15th century AD, or CE as it's called today. Later, of course, Europe became the center of world capitalism and in fact was the origin of that system, tied very much to its expansion through the African slave trade, through the exploitation of the so-called New World, and so on. But medieval society predates that. Now, ancient societies such as Greece and Rome were obviously important centers of human civilization much longer than medieval society, but the heights may in a sense be considered similar because the Roman Empire really lasted only about 500 years, which is a roughly similar time period to the 300 or 400 years that feudalism existed in Europe. The ideas of ancient Rome and medieval Europe actually appear similar on their face, but there were still important differences in their social meaning. In the case of medieval Europe, the Catholic Church played a central role in organizing that society. Part of the problem for the European peninsula was that after the fall of the Roman Empire, the society fell apart into very many small units, and so there really was no longer any central political authority, and so the Catholic Church rose as a single unifying organization of Europe, and therefore Catholic thought became the ruling ideology of the medieval period. Now, interestingly, Catholic thought has at least two major contradictory threads. The early one, the early persecuted church, advocated radical egalitarianism, of which liberation theology today is a modern reflection. But there was also the institutionalized hierarchical thread which dominated, and that came after the conversion of Constantine in the 4th century, where the church became part of the ruling structure of Europe. This institutionalized hierarchical thread included a kind of Aristotelian view of a natural hierarchical order of society, and that continues to be reflected actually in the structure of today's established Catholic Church. Now, I'd like you to read over this slide with some care. It's also available for you under the lecture notes, so you don't have to just read it real quick right now. But the idea is that there was a transition from European tribalism to feudalism, and it's helpful to get an understanding of how these transitions occur. But for the purposes of this video, I really just want to focus on the fact that there was really very little development of the forces of production throughout this period of feudalism, and that the class stratification that emerged coming out of tribalism was actually a very conservative force, and the Catholic Church's ideas were at the center of it. Now, the general philosophy of the feudal period is based on concepts of natural law and divine right. Divine rights suggest that all things really belong to God. Natural law, which is a corollary really of divine right, suggests that all goods and wealth that humanity holds or controls on earth are in fact community property of humanity as a whole. However, the problem facing humanity is that there is original sin, the fall from grace, the temptation of Adam by Eve with the apple. And so as a result of this original sin, humanity is not able to communally hold property in an orderly fashion. As a result of this, then property rights are needed and inevitable in order to have a functioning society, and that becomes something that the medieval scholars called positive law. Thus, positive law allows a flawed humanity to get as close as possible to the condition of natural law. Now, to anyone with a modern eye, we would see that there's an incredible contradiction between the legitimacy of private ownership of property and the imperative of equal communal advantage. If you own the property, then you are entitled, at least in a modern sense, to its fruits, to whatever it can give you. If you believe in communal advantage, then whatever the fruits of a particular piece of property may be do not really belong to you, but are in fact community property, which to a modern eye would negate the concept of private ownership of the means of production or of anything else for that matter. Under the feudal period, property holders are considered to be stewards or caretakers of the property for the benefit of all humanity, and therefore private property in this feudal view could not be treated apart from its social impact. Now, there's some very strong statements by the theologians about this. They argue, in fact, that if you are not prepared to give away your property to others who need it, then you are failing fundamentally. It is a duty, not an act of charity, to give what people need to them if you have it. Thomas Aquinas, the leading theologian of the feudal period and author of the Summa Theologica, which is available in your readings, argues that, and you can read the quote, that people are really sharing everything even though they belong to certain people, and other theologians affirm this. And finally, Aquinas forcefully asserts, there is a time when we sin mortally if we omit to give alms to someone when we see that his need is evident and urgent, and that he is not likely to be succored otherwise, when he has the superfluous goods which he does not need for the time being, so far as he can judge with probability. And so therefore, you are committing mortal sin if you don't give away your property to someone who needs it, unless, of course, giving it away would lead to your death. But that's a little unusual. Finally, Aquinas not only felt that that was a moral issue, but also that enforcing such moral obligations was something that the state should do. Now, this is a little different from the ancient views on property. The social obligations of the kind that Aquinas talks about were really not present in the ancient world. Instead, the responsibility of the household was to guarantee the well-being of all the members of the household, but not necessarily the broader society. Aquinas' views, of course, are very much different from modern capitalist ideas about private property. We still have exceptions to the principle that you can do whatever you want to with your property. There's homeowner association rules in townhome communities, there's zoning rules, and so on. But usually we think of these things as exceptions rather than as the norm for a society. And so we end up with trying to figure out what was the economic thinking of the feudal period. In some ways, it's really more of an art than a science. It's sort of halfway between morality, which is a set of rules that regulate the conduct of an individual, and politics, which regulates the conduct of the sovereign or the temporal ruler. So sort of a midway between morality and politics. Others have argued that for the medievalists it was a branch of ethics. Now, it's true that medieval writers never developed any kind of economic laws in the sense of laws of motion, of development of a society that developed independent of the will of people. Rather, they developed rules of conduct of economic affairs based on the principles derived from natural law. The primary philosophical idea was commutative justice, from which the ideas of the just price and the prohibition of usury derived. And that is a good point for us to plan to take up these issues when we have our next class meeting. I hope you've enjoyed this video clip, and I hope that you will share your property in line with what they said they wanted to do in the medieval period, even if they didn't really do it. So long for now.